A dust storm sweeps across Whisper Valley, and with it, a raid that shatters a young woman's life. Lena Porter wakes bound in a riverside camp, declared a prize by Calder Wolf, the chief's nephew. But one man refuses, Roan Mercer, a quiet cowboy who breaks horses, mends tack, and speaks with calm steadiness. He lays a blanket, turns his back, and says without words that dignity matters more than custom. Yet, in a camp where power is law, his defiance sparks danger. When morning comes, the valley whispers, what will happen to a cowboy who dares to say no? The storm came first. Wind funneled down Whisper Valley, carrying dust that cut the throat and grit that stung the eyes. Families scattered for cover, cattle pressed against rock bluffs, and wagons rattled like dice in a gambler's hand. In that chaos, Lena Porter clutched her younger brother's wrist, dragging him toward the cottonwoods. "This way!" she shouted over the roar. But the wind swallowed her voice, and a sudden rush of riders broke through the haze. Faces painted, braids flying, the raiding party swept downriver. Horses screamed, hooves striking sparks from stone. Lena's brother cried out once, his small hand slipping from hers. She turned, blind in the dust, searching. A blow at her back sent her sprawling. When she woke, night had fallen. She was bound on a saddle, the smell of sweat and leather in her nose, her wrists raw from rope. Torches flickered along the riverbank, marking a camp. She was unstrapped and pushed toward the firelight, stumbling to her knees. Men gathered, laughter sharp, drums thumping low. A young man stepped forward, tall, shoulders broad, his expression carved with pride. "She is mine," he declared, voice carrying across the camp. "By right of raid, by law of my kin." This was Calder Wolf, nephew to the chief, his eyes glinting with triumph. The others nodded, some jeering, some indifferent. To them, it was settled, a prize claimed. But one man did not cheer. Roan Mercer stood, apart, hands calloused from rope and rein, a quiet horsebreaker known more for mending tack than for boasting. He had spent months in this camp, trading labor for passage, never seeking place or power. He spoke little, watched much, and lived by habits carved from ranch life: early rising, steady work, clean dealings. Calder barked at him. "You, Mercer, hold the prize till dawn. Keep her ready for the river right." Roan's jaw tightened. He looked at Lena, her eyes wide, breath shaking, then back to Calder. "I'll hold nothing that ain't mine," he said evenly. Laughter rippled, some mocking, some surprised. Calder's grin sharpened. "Then keep her near. My claim stands." He shoved the blanket at Roan and turned away, swagger thick. Roan caught the blanket, heavy with smoke, and walked to where Lena sat trembling. He laid it down beside her, slow, not forcing it. "You'll need this," he said softly. Then he turned his back, sat a few feet away, and began whittling a scrap of wood as though she were any other soul sharing firelight. Lena blinked, confused. She had expected cruelty, taunts, demands. Instead, she was given silence. A space, however small. The night stretched long, drums faded, torches burned low, and whispers traveled through the camp. About the cowboy who had turned his back. About the woman Calder claimed, yet Mercer shielded without a word. Some said he was foolish, tempting wrath. Others said maybe he had the spine of a mountain, steady even against a chief's kin. Lena lay awake, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her fear easing by a sliver. She stared at Roan's back, straight and unmoving, and for the first time since the raid, she felt something besides terror. A question stirred. Why would a man risk himself to give a stranger space? By dawn, the dust had settled over the valley, but not over the camp. Men rose restless, murmurs thick. Calder strutted, ready to enforce his claim, but eyes were on Roan Mercer, the quiet cowboy who had said no without raising his voice. The camp whispered, and whispers had a way of spreading farther than torches could burn. Morning broke pale along Whisper River, but the camp bristled with tension. Calder Wolf strode through the circle of lodges, his turquoise-studded hat flashing, his voice booming loud enough for all to hear. "Custom holds. She is mine. No cowboy's silence will undo it." The men near the fires nodded, some out of loyalty, some out of fear. Roan Mercer didn't argue. He crouched by a skittish mare tied near the water trough, rubbing her neck in steady circles, until she blew out a long breath. He had learned long ago that calming a horse sometimes did more than shouting at men. Calder brought two of his roughest cousins, swagger heavy in their steps. They pushed close, laughing. "Move aside, stable hand. Let the woman learn her place." One shoved Roan's shoulder. Roan didn't rise to it. His voice was level. "A person ain't property, that's all I'll say." Then he turned to Lena, who stood stiff near the corral, eyes wide. He handed her a dipper of water. "Drink. You'll need your strength." The cousins muttered, thrown off by his calm, and stalked back to Calder. Their laughter rang hollow. Lena sipped slow, clutching the tin. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Roan kept his gaze on the mare's ears, watching for a flick of alarm. "Because silence matters more than shouting. You're owed space, not chains." A soft voice joined them. "He speaks true." It was Two Pines, the elder grandmother, her back bent but her eyes sharp. She had seen many raids, many wrongs, and she did not waste words. She placed a hand on Lena's shoulder. "Watch him." He does not waste breath. Nearby, a boy with quick eyes lingered, feeding scraps to Roan's dogs. He studied the cowboy with curiosity, noting how the animals trusted him. The boy said nothing, but in his silence was a seed of allegiance. By nightfall, whispers moved faster than fire. Some in camp muttered that Roan had insulted custom. Others said maybe he was reminding them that even law had limits. Lena sat close to the fire, her hands clenched around the blanket. Across the flames, Calder's eyes bored into her, promising that dawn would bring no mercy. Then she noticed something. Calder's saddle thrown carelessly near the corral. A strip of cloth dangled from the horn. Her heart leapt. It was her brother's scarf, torn, the one he had been wearing when the dust storm struck. She swallowed hard, hope and fear colliding. Her brother was alive somewhere. He had to be. She looked toward Roan, who sat mending tack in silence, the firelight casting lines across his face. He didn't look up, but somehow she felt he already knew the truth. This fight was about more than custom. It was about dignity, and maybe about finding the lost before it was too late. The camp hummed low with tension, the kind that settles in bones before a storm. And here's where I'll ask you. If you were Roan, facing custom that says, "A woman is a prize," while a frightened brother's scarf hangs from your rival's saddle, would you risk everything to defy it? Tell me in the comments, and if stories of quiet courage speak to you, share this one or subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of Roan's stand. The next morning carried the smell of damp sage and smoke from dying campfires. Roan Mercer rose early, same as always, feeding horses before most men stirred. He worked with calm hands, though his mind turned over what he'd seen the night before. Calder Wolf, strutting with that scarf tied careless to his saddle horn. Proof was thin as thread, but proof nonetheless. He poured coffee into a tin cup and walked toward the lodge of Two Pines. The elder grandmother sat cross-legged near her fire, grinding herbs. Her eyes, sharp despite her years, lifted as he approached. "You rise before the sun, horseman," she said. "Habit," Roan replied, setting the cup before her. "And respect. Coffee for counsel, if you'll take it." She sipped, nodding once. "You ask something heavy." Roan crouched low, voice quiet. "The boy brags custom makes Lena his. I need to know truth, not boast, not noise. What does the river law say?" Two Pines stirred the cup slow, the steam rising like a prayer. "A bond is no bond unless spoken freely, beside running water, with witnesses not of kin. That is our law. Without her word, Calder has nothing but air." Roan let that settle, heavy as iron. "So, he can't force it. Not lawful." Her eyes narrowed. "He can try. Men often do, but law is not on his side." Roan tipped his hat. "Then daylight will have to hear it plain." As he stood, his gaze caught on a rawhide shield leaning against the lodge wall. Carved thin across its surface were faint cattle brands, slashed and altered, lines burned to hide their origin. Roan's brow furrowed. He knew the silver spur brand, 2 crossing bars, better than most. This mark had been shaved into something else, but the ghost of the original lingered. He didn't touch it, just let the image burn into memory. Later, at his lean-to, he opened his small ledger, the same one he used for horse tallies and trail notes. With quick strokes, he sketched the altered brands, noting the cuts. If truth about Lena wouldn't sway the camp, maybe theft would. Men might ignore a woman's dignity, but they rarely ignored stolen beef. By mid-afternoon, Roan slipped away from the bustle, following the basalt ridges beyond camp. He led his bay gelding into a hollow where rock gave way to soft grass. There, hidden among the stones, he found a spring bubbling clear and cold, running down into a narrow channel before sinking again. He cupped water in his palms, drinking deep, sweet as any he'd tasted in months. He knelt, watching the stream cut its path. In a valley where water was fought over more fiercely than gold, this spring could mean everything. His jaw tightened. For now, it stayed secret. But one day, it could be a bargaining stone heavier than Calder's. Bluster. That night, Lena sat near the fire, the blanket still around her shoulders. She leaned close when Roan returned. "You found something," she whispered. Roan glanced at Calder across the circle, loud with laughter, scarf still tied to his saddle. Then he looked back at her. "Custom's not on his side. You'll need to stand by water, with witnesses, and say your will. No one can twist that." Her breath caught. "Could I say no?" Rowan's eyes held hers steady. "You can, if you're willing, but it'll take courage, and more than mine." Her hand tightened on the blanket. "I've lived enough fear. I'll find the courage." The fire popped, sparks leaping skyward. Around them, whispers still ran, about the cowboy who turned away, about the woman who hadn't broken. Roan knew the storm was building, and soon, proof and patience would have to meet daylight together. The storm that had swept across Whisper Valley left the air cool, the sky washed clean. By dusk, the camp gathered for a victory tea. Feast drums beat low, smoke from roasting meat drifted through the air, and laughter rose sharper than usual. Yet beneath the noise, a current of tension ran. Everyone knew Calder Wolf meant to claim Lena Porter at sunrise by the river. Rowan Mercer sat near the fire's edge, repairing a bridle strap. He moved calm as always, though his mind was fixed on what Two Pines had told him. Consent had to be spoken beside running water, witnessed by those not bound by kin. Calder had bluster, but he had no lawful ground if Lena refused. Across the fire, Lena's eyes stayed wide, her breath shallow. She leaned closer to Rowan when Calder's laughter cut through the night. "What if my voice shakes?" she whispered. Rowan's hands stilled on the leather. "Then let it shake. Truth don't lose strength just because it trembles." She swallowed, still doubtful. Rowan reached for a stick and wrote 3 words in the dirt with the blunt end. In the camp's tongue, they meant "my will chooses." He tapped the words. "Say them plain." Nothing more. They'll understand. Lena traced the marks with her eyes, mouthing them until the syllables felt real in her mouth. For the first time, a flicker of steadiness lit her face. The drumming shifted, louder now. Calder rose, declaring for all to hear, "At sunrise, by Whisper River, she will be bound." The cowboy's silence won't change a thing. He lifted his cup, daring the crowd to challenge him. None did. But eyes slid toward Roan, watching how he would respond. Roan only fed another stick to the fire and kept working on the bridle. His calm was its own defiance. At the edge of camp, a figure rode in, Sheriff Abner from Dusty Creek. He had been passing through, drawn by the storm and rumors of raids. He dismounted stiffly, eyeing the gathering with unease. "I've no say in camp law," he muttered to Roan when their paths crossed. "But if cattle are stolen, that's my jurisdiction. You give me reason, I'll act." Roan met his gaze, steady. Proof's coming, not far beyond. The old prospector who lingered near Whisper Butte sharpened his knife on a whetstone. He had seen more than he let on, and word was he had a message for Roan, something about missing stock and a boy kept hidden. Timing mattered, and the storm rolling in from the west gave cover for secrets moving through the valley. As night deepened, thunder growled across the ridges. Lightning split the horizon, brief but blinding. Rain would come before dawn. Roan looked skyward, almost relieved. A storm could stall a ritual, or it could test whether courage held in wind and rain. Lena sat with her blanket pulled tight, the words, "my will chooses," echoing in her mind. She turned once to Roan. "Why help me? You could have walked away." Roan tied off the bridle strap, set it aside. His answer was simple, because a man's worth is measured by what he refuses to let happen. Not just what he builds. The drums faded into the night's thunder. By firelight, whispers spread again, about the dawn, about the cowboy who wouldn't bend, and the woman who might just find her voice beside the river. Rain fell steady through the night, turning the camp paths to dark clay. By dawn, the storm had broken into a mist that clung to everything. The Whisper River ran high, its voice louder than usual, as if it knew it would soon be asked to witness something heavy. Rowan Mercer rose before first light. He had not slept much, but then he never did when the air carried this kind of weight. He saddled his gelding, slipped his ledger into the saddlebag, and carried a folded note sealed with wax. It was addressed to Sheriff Abner of Dusty Creek. He found the lawman near the camp's edge, tightening girths. "Sheriff," Roan said quietly, "this belongs in your hands." He passed the note. Abner frowned. "What's in it?" "Altered brands. Counts of missing beef. The kind that ties men like Calder Wolf to more than bluster. Keep it safe until the time comes." Abner tucked it inside his coat, jaw hard. "If what you claim proves out, I'll have cause. But know this, Mercer, I won't fight your fight. Proof is the only rope I'll pull. That's all I'm asking." Roan tipped his hat and rode back into camp. By midday, word had spread. Roan had filed a request with the council for a river witness hearing, citing custom Two Pines had explained. Men gathered in knots, murmuring. Calder laughed louder than ever, but the sound carried a brittle edge. That afternoon, Roan led Lena away from the bustle, following the basalt ridges until they reached the hidden spring. The air there was cooler, the water running clear against dark stone. "This is the place," Roan told her. "No ears, but ours. Practice now." Lena closed her eyes, whispering the words he had taught her. "My will chooses." The first time it cracked, the second time it steadied. The third time she said it strong enough to carry across water. She opened her eyes, breath shaking. "Do you think it will matter?" Roan crouched, cupping the barrel, spring water in his hands. "It matters to you. That's enough to start. Law and proof will carry the rest." When they returned to camp, tension hung like a storm waiting to break. Calder's men circled. Without warning, rough hands grabbed Roan's arms, shoving him hard toward the stockade near the corral. Calder's voice rang sharp. "Stable hands who meddle with law belong in the dirt." He thrust Roan inside the rough pen, locking the gate with a sneer. The crowd laughed as Roan fell into the straw. Calder wasn't finished. He strode to Roan's colt, a young chestnut the cowboy had trained from near birth. With a flick of his knife, Calder nicked the tendon at the horse's leg, not enough to kill, but enough to lame. The colt staggered, crying out. Roan's jaw clenched, but he didn't shout. He pressed his hand to the straw, steadying his breath. Anger would only feed Calder's fire. Lena's hands shook where she stood. She wanted to scream, to strike, to curse, but she forced herself still. Her eyes darted toward the stockade, searching. Roan caught her gaze and gave a small, firm nod. Steady. Later, when the crowd thinned, Lena slipped close. She crouched near the wooden slats, whispering, "I thought they'd break you." Roan's voice came even, calm. "Not yet. Look under the loose plank by my foot." She reached and pulled. Beneath it lay his ledger, dry despite the rain, filled with sketches of the altered brands and tallies of stolen cattle. He pushed it into her hands. "Keep it hidden. When the time comes, this will speak louder than I can." Her breath caught as she tucked it beneath her blanket. She rose taller than she had since the raid. "Then I'll carry it." For both of us, Roan leaned back against the stockade wall, mud soaking his shoulders, and let himself close his eyes. The colt's soft whimper still cut at him, but the ledger was safe. That was enough, for now. Rain pounded Whisper Valley through the night, heavy drops drumming against hides and tin. By morning, the camp paths had turned to mud, sucking at boots and hooves alike. Inside the stockade, Roan Mercer sat on damp straw, shoulders drawn but spirit unbroken. Every breath smelled of wet earth and horse sweat. Outside, Calder Wolf paced, his laughter cutting sharp through the rain. At midday, Calder threw the gate wide, dragging Roan into the open yard. "Here's your cowboy," he barked to the crowd. "Not a defender, not a fighter, just stable help who don't know his place." Mud splashed Roan's boots as Calder shoved him down. The men jeered, though some averted their eyes. Two Pines stood near her lodge, face unreadable, watching without a word. The sharp-eyed boy clutched Roan's dogs by the scruff, holding them back from growling. Even in humiliation, Roan's silence carried weight. He didn't spit back, didn't plead. He simply straightened once more, as steady as a fence post in a flood. That evening, while the rain eased to a drizzle, Lena slipped to the stockade with a basket of bread. She crouched low, whispering, "I found it." The ledger, hidden under the plank. Her hands trembled as she pulled it from beneath her shawl, opening to the sketches Roan had made, the altered brands, the tally of stolen cattle, the note about the spring. Roan's eyes softened in the gloom. "Good. Keep it safe. Those marks tell truth louder than my voice. She shook her head. Why didn't you show them sooner? Because timing's half the fight, Roan murmured. Rush a horse before it's broke, you'll get thrown. Wait, and the rope holds steady, her eyes glistened in the lamplight. They humiliated you. They lamed your colt, and still you wait. Roan leaned closer to the bars. Patience ain't weakness, Lena. It's the only way to make sure when proof comes, no one can turn away. She closed the ledger with trembling fingers. Then I'll carry it. If you fall, I'll speak. The sharp-eyed boy appeared from the shadows. Dirt streaked on his face. He tugged at Lena's sleeve. 2 Pines says to show her. She'll know what to do. Together, they stole into the elder's lodge. The fire burned low, herbs hanging from the beams. 2 Pines accepted the ledger with hands that shook only slightly. She turned the pages, her gaze narrowing at the brands. These are the Silver Spurs marks, she said. I saw their herds pass last spring. Calder cut them thin, but the ghost lines remain. This is theft. Lena clutched the ledger. Will the council listen? 2 Pines met her eyes. With cattle stolen and a woman held against her will, they cannot turn away, not if witnesses stand. But you must speak tomorrow, at the river. Do you have courage? Lena swallowed, then nodded. Yes, I'll speak. The old woman's lips curved faintly. Then I will stand with you. Outside, Sheriff Abner lingered at the camp's edge, his hat dripping rain. He had heard enough murmurs to keep him rooted. Jurisdiction was thin here, but theft and kidnapping were crimes under territorial law. He touched the folded note Rowan had given him, still dry in his coat. His time was coming too. Back in the stockade, Roan lay on the damp straw, listening to the camp settle. He pictured Lena carrying the ledger, 2 Pines ready to bear witness, the boy with eyes too sharp for his age. His colt whickered softly from the corral, injured but alive. Roan closed his eyes, the sound steadying him. Tomorrow, at the river, silence would give way to voices. The question was whether the camp would hear them, or turn away once more. Morning broke cold and clear, the Whisper River running high from the storm. The camp gathered along its bank, every eye turned toward the council stones. It was here that bonds were spoken, here that consent was either given or denied. The air held more weight than the clouds ever could. Roan Mercer stood under guard, mud still on his boots, but his shoulders square. 2 Pines, the elder grandmother, leaned on her staff nearby. Sheriff Abner sat his horse at the edge, jurisdiction uncertain, but presence undeniable. Lena Porter stood trembling, blanket wrapped close, the ledger hidden beneath its folds. Calder Wolf strode forward first, turquoise flashing at his hatband, voice booming. This woman is mine by raid and by right. Today the river binds her to me. No cowboy's silence can change what custom demands. He turned to Lena, sneer wide. Speak it now. Claim me. Lena's breath shuddered, but her voice rose clear. Words Roan had pressed into her memory. My will chooses. The camp hushed. She steadied herself, louder now. And I do not choose you. A ripple cut through the crowd. Surprise, some gasps, a few approving nods. Calder's face darkened. His pride struck harder than any blow. 2 Pines lifted her staff. By river law, no bond holds without free word. She has spoken. Calder, you stand with nothing but air. Roan stepped forward then, calm as always, and handed the ledger to 2 Pines. She opened it, showing sketches of altered brands, tallies of missing cattle, and notations of Calder's shield cut thin to hide the truth. These marks, Roan said, voice even, belong to Silver Spur Ranch. Beef stolen, brands carved false. His claim is not only without consent, it is tied to theft. Murmurs swelled louder. Sheriff Abner held up a signed affidavit. I've papers from Silver Spur's foreman. Missing stock matches these marks. This is territorial law, not camp custom. Calder's bravado cracked. He lunged at Rowan, rage spitting from his throat. Rowan slipped aside, calm as a horseman dodging a kick. With a flick of rope he had coiled at his belt, he caught Calder's wrist and twisted, disarming him without strike or blood. Calder fell to his knees, gasping, mud streaking his fine boots. Rowan released the rope, stepping back as though the fight was never his. The elder councilman raised a palm. Enough. Proof has been shown. Consent has been denied. Calder Wolf, you will stand judgment before sundown. The camp's murmur shifted, heavy now with certainty. Calder's cousins shrank back, eyes darting away. For the first time, Calder's swagger collapsed under the weight of his own deeds. Lena stood taller, breath still ragged, but voice her own. She turned once toward Roan, her eyes filled not with fear, but with something steadier, trust. Roan only tipped his hat, the smallest nod, as if to say, "The truth did the work, not me." The river roared on, witness to it all. By mid-afternoon, the council gathered again, their faces lined with age and duty. The Whisper River rolled dark beside them, its sound steady as a drum. Calder Wolf stood bound by rope, his swagger gone. The air was heavy with more than rain. It carried the weight of judgment. The eldest councilman raised his hand. "Calder Wolf, nephew of our chief, you stand accused not only of pressing false bond, but of theft and deceit. By camp law, you shamed our custom. By territorial law, you stole what was not yours. Do you deny it?" Calder's voice rasped, defiance slipping through his teeth. "I took what I could. That is strength." Two Pines struck her staff hard against the ground. "No, that is weakness dressed as pride." Sheriff Abner swung down from his horse, the affidavit in his hand. "You'll answer for rustling and kidnapping under territorial law. The judge in Dusty Creek will see you next." The rope pulled tight. For the first time, Calder's eyes flickered with fear. His cousins looked away, unwilling to claim him now. As Abner led him toward the horses, the camp parted, their silence louder than any jeer. Calder Wolf was finished, his shadow broken. Lena Porter stood near the water's edge, breath unsteady. The blanket slipped from her shoulders as if a burden had fallen away with it. She whispered, almost to herself, "It's over." Roan Mercer stepped beside her, his presence calm as ever. "One piece is over, but healing don't come in a single breath." Before she could answer, the sound of hooves clattered against the ridge. An old prospector rode down, his beard dripping from the rain, and behind him clung a boy, small, thin, his eyes wide with hope and fear. Lena gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Noah!" Her voice cracked as she ran forward, pulling her brother down into her arms. He clutched her tight, sobbing against her shoulder. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered, pressing her face into his hair. The prospector tipped his hat. "He's been with me these past weeks. Fed him, kept him out of sight, same as Roan asked the night of the raid. The cowboy came searching through the storm, and when he found the boy, he told me, 'Keep him hidden till the right time.'" Lena turned, eyes wet, toward Roan. "You knew?" All this time, Roan gave a small nod. "Better he was safe than paraded as leverage. I figured you needed hope, not another weight to carry." Her tears broke into a laugh, fragile and bright. "You carried that burden alone." For me, Roan looked toward the river, voice low. "Not alone." Just quiet, Two Pines stepped forward, laying a hand on Lena's arm. "Your brother's return is your true bond. No man's claim can shadow that." The camp exhaled together, as though the valley itself had been holding its breath. Even the river seemed to soften, its roar easing. That night, fires burned lower, steadier. Lena and Noah sat side by side, eating bread and stew, their shoulders brushing. Roan kept to his usual distance, but his eyes lingered on them, a faint peace showing where tension had once lived. Lena looked across the flames, meeting his gaze. For the first time, she didn't see only the quiet cowboy who defied a nephew's claim. She saw the man who had shielded her dignity, searched through storm for her brother, and carried secrets not for pride, but for mercy. Her voice carried soft but certain. "Where do we go from here?" Roan's reply was plain. "Where choice leads, not chains." The fire popped, sparks drifting upward. Healing had begun, but the question of where to build a home still waited, like seeds needing soil. The valley breathed easier once Calder Wolf was led away, his swagger broken and his voice silenced beneath the weight of both law and custom. Yet even with the danger gone, the ground between Roan Mercer and Lena Porter felt delicate, like soil after a storm, rich, but waiting for what seeds might take root. Days stretched into a calmer rhythm. The Whisper River, swollen by rain, ran steady, carrying away more than just mud. It carried the last of fear. Children who had once stared now lingered near Lena, curious about her brother Noah, who darted between campfires with a grin that came quicker each day. Roan worked as always, mending tack, checking horses, repairing the colt's leg with patience and soft hands. The animal limped but lived, and each day its stride grew a touch surer. Lena often came to help, setting hay or holding the bucket. One afternoon she asked, "Why do you spend so much time on what may never heal?" Roan glanced at her, his voice plain. "Because sometimes what looks broken just needs time to show what it can still carry." Her eyes softened. She knew he wasn't only speaking of the colt. When the council met again, Roan presented the hidden spring he had found behind the basalt ridge. He stood before both camp elders and Sheriff Abner, ledger open. "This water belongs to all," he said. "Mark it in the record. Neutral ground, shared by ranch and camp, alike 2 pines nodded. Then let it be so. A spring for all, a reminder that dignity grows where respect is kept." Lena listened, her brother's hand in hers. She felt the weight of choice settle on her heart. Not a demand, not a chain, but an open path. That evening, by the river where she had once been told she was property, she stepped forward of her own will. Her voice was strong. "I choose Roan Mercer." Not as a claim, but as a partner. The council bore witness. Noah squeezed her hand tighter, grinning through tears. Roan only tipped his hat, but the quiet in his eyes spoke louder than any vow. In the weeks that followed, they set rows of beans by the spring. Children came to learn letters from Lena, tracing words in the dirt with sticks. Roan showed them how to read weather, how to mend leather, how to listen to a horse's breath. Slowly, a life built itself, not with bluster, but with steady hands. Mercy had stood taller than pride, and in that stand, a home had taken shape. And maybe that's the lesson Whisper Valley leaves us with, that freedom is strongest when it's chosen, not forced. If you were in Lena's place, would you have trusted Roan's quiet strength, or walked a different path? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if stories of dignity, mercy, and second chances speak to you, saddle up and subscribe for the next ride.